Hello everyone, and welcome to this AsiaEdit Author Success webinar. I'm Trevor Lane, and in the past 25 years, I've worked on all sides of academic publishing. I've developed and managed peer-reviewed journals and advised editors and edited thousands of papers and trained thousands of authors. So I'm very happy to share with you some tips on maximizing the chance that your next journal manuscript will be accepted. Now, the webinar will last about 1 hour, and there will be 15 minutes at the end for a chance for Q&A, for questions and answers. And the main part will be divided into 3 sections on understanding peer review, avoiding desk rejection, and avoiding peer review rejection. Now, a word about the Zoom tools. I'll be asking you some quick live questions, so please use the hand tool to raise and then lower your hand, and then the chat tool to answer the short live question. And then please reserve the question box for the Q&A session. So if you have a question to ask me, type it in the question box and we'll get to it at the end. So the first section is on understanding the peer review process, because we need to understand the process before we know how to navigate peer review and increase our chances of acceptance. So the first task I'd like you to do is put your hand up if you think peer review is like this, or if you've been through the peer review process, whether this was the experience for you. So some people think peer review is like this, and it can feel like this. And for health and safety reasons, I'd like to say that this cartoon represents attacking the research paper, not the researcher. Now, you'll notice the road is long and straight, but there's an updated version of this cartoon on this next slide, which shows actually it's more difficult. It's an uphill struggle to have a paper accepted, and it's a winding path. It's not a straight path. And actually, you might not even begin the path because your paper might get rejected even before the peer review process. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll learn some tips on getting onto the path and then navigating the path to getting a paper accepted. And it might feel like this because journals cannot publish everything, so they do need to reject some of the papers, and they can't peer review everything because some papers are obviously not suitable for the journal. So we'll take a look at that now. So what do journals want? There was a blog on Elsevier that had some points, so I'll summarize them here. Journals want articles that provide insight into an important issue. The insight should be useful for the real world in decision-making, developing new or current theories, and for stimulating new and important questions. Also, you should use appropriate methods and apply them rigorously. The data should support the conclusions. The article should mention the past literature and make clear arguments. And the article should be well written and easy to understand and logical without contradictions. So check your work fulfills all these points, and we can turn them around and form an inverse checklist as well. So this is what journals don't want. It's an article that provides little insight into an unimportant issue. The insight isn't useful for the real world, and you've used inappropriate methods, or you've used appropriate ones but wrongly, or the data don't support the conclusions. The article doesn't link to the past research or make clear arguments, and the article is poorly presented, and it's hard to understand, illogical, and has contradictions. So check through your work that you haven't done any of these things. Now, the green ones, number 4 and 5, it might be possible to salvage your paper and just update and revise the language and rewrite or edit it. But the red points, 1, 2, and 3, actually are nothing to do with the manuscript. It's the planning process and the research process. So this really does show that trying to have a paper pass the peer review process, it begins right from the beginning when you're planning and doing your research. You can't save a bad paper just by writing it well. So let's have a look at the peer review process. And I said that it's hard to even get the paper to the first step. That's because the paper could be desk reviewed and desk rejected. So the editor or the journal office will do preliminary checks and check for things like completeness, adherence to guidelines, the writing quality, and whether the references contain some current relevant ones. They're not all old references. And these blue items, you would be given a chance maybe to revise and resubmit your paper, or even if the journal desk rejects your paper but doesn't mention it, then you could still probably resubmit your paper and try to fix these points. The black text, though, are items where your paper might get desk rejected without a chance of resubmission. So things like whether it's suitable for the topic, article, and study type of the journal, whether there are problems with the population and sample and method, whether there's bias or ethical problems, whether the data are not current or new, there's nothing new about the paper and it's not useful. But if you do survive this step, then your paper will get selected for peer review. And here the editor is in charge and makes the final decision. And at least 2 reviewers who are experts, who are your peers, will judge your paper and critique it. Now, there's different types of peer review. There's single anonymized or single blind, where the reviewer knows the author's name, but you don't know the reviewer's name. Double blind, where both authors and reviewers don't know each other's names. And triple blind or triple anonymized, where the editor doesn't know the reviewer or author's names. So there's debate on which version is fairer, but different journals will use a different type of peer review. Open peer review or open identity review is where all the parties know each other's names. Again, you might have a chance to revise and resubmit your paper based on the blue items. So maybe the way it's presented currently is not interesting. It doesn't cover the literature in a comprehensive way. There's problems with the analysis or interpretation or the writing style or organization. So if you're lucky, you might get a chance to resubmit. However, if there is a flawed method or a problem with originality, the paper isn't your own work after all, or it doesn't make a big enough contribution, then the paper would get rejected, probably without a chance of resubmission. But again, if you survive this process, your paper then gets it. They will index your paper as well. So this is the traditional or pre-publication peer review process, but there does exist another type, a newer type called post-publication peer review, and the F1000 research platform journals will use this system. So beware of what type of peer review the journal uses. And for this one, the journal office will probably do the desk review and check for completeness and general intelligibility and whether the English is good enough for the reviewers to understand and whether it's appropriate for content, quality, tone, and format for the journal. Again, the blue item, you might have a chance to revise and resubmit. Now, if the paper survives the desk review stage, then it will be published online straight away and peer reviewed at the same time. So this is slightly different from before. So this is why it's post-publication peer review. And then the editor and reviewers will judge the paper. And generally, actually, only if 2 reviewers approve the paper, then it's accepted. And the peer review system is open identity, so everyone knows their names, and it's open and signed reviews. So the peer review reports also get published alongside the paper, and the whole system uses a public platform, so it's publicly visible by everyone. So again, this is a different type of peer review. You might get the chance to revise and resubmit, and if you pass the peer review process, your paper will get formally accepted and then indexed if the journal is in an international index. So what are common reasons for rejection, either at the desk stage or the peer review stage? Well, we mentioned originality. So if the journal finds out that the paper isn't original or it's not your own work, so they do a plagiarism scan, or that you've submitted the paper to many journals at the same time, or it's already published, then they can desk reject your paper. Also, they check for whether the paper is ethical, the standard of the language, structure, figures and referencing, and whether the submission package is complete, and whether it complies with journal guidelines. So any of these things, if you fail the test here at the desk review stage, it's an easy reason for the journal to reject your paper. So again, check all these things when you submit your paper. An important point, again, at the desk review stage is whether your paper matches the aim and scope or article type of the journal. So journals should have on their websites an aim and scope like a mission statement, a company mission statement, and that will say what the journal does accept. So again, look for that and match it carefully. Now at the peer review stage, it's likely that the reviewers will be very eagle-eyed and they'll watch out for things like flawed design and methods and analysis and problems with the controls, reproducibility and validity and reliability. They'll check for whether the study is complete or whether you're trying to divide one study into many papers called salami slicing or salami publishing, where the results are actually too thin or superficial to be meaningful. So the work might not contribute enough, or it might not be interesting enough. Or again, the conclusions may not be supported by the data. So when you're checking your work, again, check for all these things. We mentioned journal guidelines. So this is an easy step to do, is to look for the information for authors, sometimes called the instructions for authors or author guidelines, author instructions, and make sure you really do know the aims and scope and the intended readership of the journal and the article types it accepts. So there are some journals which are purely review journals, so there's no point submitting an original research article to a review journal. And some journals prefer some study types to others, so some don't publish case reports, or some, if it's a biomedical journal, they prefer human studies, not animal studies. So check for things like that. There should be guidelines on what we just mentioned, the originality, your work should be unpublished, it's not salami, it's submitted only once, and there are certain declarations and forms you have to use, whether the journal allows you to upload supplementary files if your paper's too long, and then requirements on the language and language quality, and the submission process. Then an important distinction between journals is the acceptance criteria. Some journals only look at the technical quality, but some also look at the novelty. Has your work ever been done before? Is it completely new? Is it impactful? And will it make the worldwide news the next day? So those are the very highly selective journals like Science or Cell or Nature. Then there will be guidelines on ethics and data policies. Many journals now require authors to upload their raw data or make it publicly available. So check whether your journal requires that. And there will be guidelines on the peer review process, as well as the actual paper itself, such as the structure, length, format, and style, the page setup, whether there's a LaTeX or Word template for the formatting, and what to do with fonts and special symbols. Then the content files will include things like the text, illustrations, whether you have to submit a bullet list of highlights, or also a visual or graphical abstract, or also a lay or general language summary or abstract. Now let's look at some tips for avoiding desk rejection. So we'll come back to all that information in this section, but first, here's a tip on what to do. So of course, you yourself be like a detective or like a peer reviewer and check everything about the target journal that you intend to submit to. So choose your target journal early, and in the chat box, maybe can you type what you think are important points to bear in mind when you choose your journal. So there's some clues there. There's some cogs. So that's suggesting hard work, working hard, or some systematic process you have to do. And then there's red, amber, green, traffic light or traffic signals. So type what you think are important points to bear in mind when you're choosing a journal. So some tips here are find, know, and think. So find a suitable journal, research it and know everything about it, and then think hard whether you do want to submit to that journal. Then the traffic signal, the traffic lights stand for think, check, and submit. And we'll get to that in the next slide. So finding a journal to find a suitable one, of course, will maximize your chance of acceptance if you do match that journal. So there are some journal search tools listed here, and these are publisher site ones, or you can use international general indexes like Scopus or Clarivate Web of Science, but whichever, so you can use keywords or your draft abstract or your title. So choose, use keywords from the draft text that you have to search for journals that publish work in a similar area. But once you do identify or shortlist some journals, double check that it's a trustworthy journal, especially if you are using something very general like Google Scholar for your searches. So there is a website called thinkchecksubmit.org, which is where the traffic lights come in. So think about the journal, whether it's trustworthy and it's not a predatory one. Use a checklist on that website, and then after you've done your homework, you can submit it. So there are things in the checklist like, do you trust the editorial board? Is if the journal is open access, which means it's free for the reader, is it a member of the DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, or whether it's subscription or open access, is the journal a member of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics? And for full disclosure, I have to declare that I'm on the Council of COPE. Then check whether the journal is also a member of other associations or subject indexes or regional indexes. So make sure you do trust the journal. So some more homework. Knowing your journal is to look for things in the journal website and its mission statement and its description text for things like the journal and article type and the aims and scope. So we mentioned that before. So the types of topic the journal publishes, the study type, and also the detail and length. So some journals publish full-length papers, or some allow you to publish shorter papers, short communications or research letters. The acceptance criteria, we said, could be only the technical quality, or also for very highly selective journals, they want novel and newsworthy research that has potential impact and is very important. And some journals require you to upload your data as well. So those things are to do with the content. Now, also including the language is the audience type. So depending on whether the journal targets experts or generalists, whether the audience is very technical or they're researchers, or whether they are policymakers, that will determine what language you use. Also, whether the journal is international or regional. Look at things like the publishing frequency, the format of the journal, whether it's print and online or only online, whether the journal allows you to upload supplementary files, whether the journal does editing and artwork and layout as part of the service. So some journals do not do editing for you, and so your work has to be perfect. They will not copy edit the work for you. And some will do news promotion for you when your article is published, but some do not. Other things to look for are the business type and fees. So subscription journals are where the library or reader pays. Open access is where the reader doesn't pay, but the author might have to pay. And hybrid offers either of these options. Check the editorial board, who owns the copyright of your paper, what type of publishing license or user license to use. So that's the Creative Commons or CC license, what the authorship criteria are, and what the research and publishing ethics are. We mentioned the peer review model, and something here to note is that some journals or publishers offer cascading or transferable review. So if your paper is rejected, they might help you pass your paper and the peer review reports to another journal. So that saves you time. You don't have to resubmit the paper again and go through another round of peer review. There's also the reputation of the journal, whether it's indexed, its world ranking, the speed of its review and publication, and how selective it is, so the percentage acceptance. So all these things you have to bear in mind when you're choosing a journal. So a very selective, high-impact journal like Nature will have very specific criteria like the novelty, strong evidence, extremely important in your field, but also in other fields. Your work represents a large advancement and is likely to influence thinking in the field, and there should be a good reason why you want to publish in Nature and not another journal. So you can argue that in the cover letter. So again, for full disclosure, in a different role, I'm an author trainer for Nature. Now, for a less selective journal, such as PLOS ONE, which we call a mega journal, they don't care about the world impact of your paper. They just look at the technical quality, such as primary scientific research. It's not been published before. Everything's reported and done to a high standard. The article adheres to reporting guidelines and data availability. The conclusions are supported, and the research meets standards of ethics and is presented in standard English. So PLOS ONE will accept a higher percentage of papers compared with Nature or Science. So the highly selective journals will only accept something like 3 to 5% of submitted papers. So check which type of journal is suitable for you. So let's have a look at journals from the journal side. They want good work to be published. They want people to either buy or read or cite the work. So they will look at a match with your articles for the aims and scope and ethics and technical quality. Some journals look at the potential impact and importance, and all of them will look at whether the work is actually valuable to the readers. The production quality also has to be high. We said that the journal does the layout for you, but they might not do the copy editing. They will take care of any indexing and permanent online archiving of your paper. But something to bear in mind is that your goal is not just to get accepted, but to have your paper kept published. So not just published, but kept published. So make sure it's good quality, because later on, even after publication, if someone finds a big mistake, then you might have to correct your paper or even retract it. And that's a public notice telling everyone that your paper's retracted. So don't give people a reason to retract your paper later on. So journals want transparent work, so data and code and high reporting quality. They might have their own checklists for you to fill in. So of course, if they have a checklist, complete that as part of the submission. There are many life science and social science checklists on the Equator Network. And there are some journals that use STAR methods or the MDAR framework guidelines. Make sure the research doesn't contain fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. So no making up of data, changing data, or copying anything, no fraud, no illegal or unethical data use. And make sure that the work is reproducible. So some journals actually want you to upload the full protocol online or to pre-register the clinical trial or other study with a journal, or clinical trials have to be registered online in an online trial registry. The work has to be ethical and approved by an ethics board. There should be consent for human participation, publication, and sharing of anonymized data, and the authors should declare any conflicts of interest, that the work might be biased, and any funding sources. And we've mentioned some publishing ethics, like submitting only once and not submitting an already published paper. So there is a database called Sherpa Romeo, because some authors upload a draft of their paper to a preprint server. So that's called a preprint. But some journals don't accept papers that have already been uploaded as a preprint, because they view that as already published. So check the journal policy, because again, that would be an automatic reason for rejection if you haven't been careful. Now, having said all this, there's also a little bit of luck for the highly selective print journals. So even though your paper might be very interesting and ethical and well reported, it might just be up to whether the editor thinks there's enough space and enough pages for your article, whether there was something accepted recently on exactly the same topic. So you might just be unlucky to do with the topic or the timeliness of the work. So bear in mind, you have to check what the journal has published recently and what its policies are. Now, we looked at desk review before, so let's look at that stage more carefully to avoid the desk rejection stage. So we want our paper to at least survive and be peer reviewed. Some journals use an international guideline for their whole procedure as well as publishing. So check the journal guidelines. They might use ICMJE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors Guidelines, or things like GPP, Good Publishing Practice, GCP, Good Clinical Practice, or American Medical Association, American Psychological Association, or Modern Languages Association styles. So if they do, then familiarize yourself with those styles and make your paper adhere as closely as possible to those styles to begin with. So the editor or the journal office will do initial checks such as plagiarism scan and checking for legality and ethics and whether the whole submission is complete and whether it makes sense. But the editor will very likely read your cover letter and title and abstract to make sure that it suits the journal's aim and scope or that it's understandable. Then actually, even though it's a boring part, they do look at your references, whether the references are recent and relevant, and whether they are actually accurate in the way you've presented them, because a quick way to see whether researchers have been careful in their research is whether they've been careful in preparing their reference list. Then the editors look at the illustrations and results, as well as the methods, to make sure that they're up to date and they're the best methods and the results match the methods. If you're lucky, then they might skim read the actual text. So they do all these initial checks, and then they check the aim and results and conclusion, whether they match each other, and if it's worth sending on for peer review. So check all these things also in your submission. So here are some tips to avoid desk rejection. Find a suitable target journal early, match the journal in all its criteria and guidelines. You could save time by checking whether your topic has been recently published by the journal, whether they are active in that debate. So that's the research stream. And if in doubt, you can send a pre-submission letter to save time. Ask if the journal would be interested in your paper, especially if it's a review article. Many journals only commission reviews. If you are confident that your paper is a good match, then highlight this in the title, abstract, and cover letter. Follow all the journal formatting guidelines and get professional help in reviewing and editing the paper, but beware of text templates or whether you like a favorite paper and then you just change a few of the words to adapt it into your paper. So don't do that because it's seen as plagiarism, and be careful of services that promise that they'll write the whole paper for you. Then check the copyright and publication ethics. Don't just copy something you've published before. Don't just cite all your own work. Get permission to use other people's data and illustrations. And then check the completeness of your submission, whether the question is answered, whether you have the abstract and keywords and references in the right format. And then if you submit to a journal that uses blinding, they shouldn't see who the paper is from. So be careful of sentences where you've said I or we, and then you have a reference number, because that will give it away who the author is. And if the journal checks that at the desk stage, it would be an automatic rejection because it hasn't been formatted correctly. So upload the correct files, check all the reporting checklists, and upload all the forms that you're meant to use. Some journals require ORCID numbers, so that's the ORCID ID number of authors. Now let's talk about the peer review process and trying to avoid rejection at peer review. So we've mentioned reliability and validity, and this is something the reviewers will definitely look for, whether the work is reliable and valid. So in the chat box, tell me which number, 1, 2, 3, or 4, which of these targets represents both reliable and valid work. that you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring or what you've promised to measure. So the correct answer is number 4. So number 1, the shots are all over the place, but they've missed the target, so that's unreliable and not valid. Number 2, one of the shots has hit the target, so we can say there is some validity there, but it's not repeatable, not reliable. Number 3, the shots are together, so it's reliable, but they've missed the target, so it's not valid. So number 4 is both reliable and valid. The shots are clustered together and they're on the target. So again, this is something to do with the planning and the research stage. So do check your methods and results before you write the paper. Now, before we said think like an editor or think like journal production or the office, now the advice is to think like a reviewer. So reviewers will be given a checklist by the journal to look for things like whether the article does suit the content and style of the journal, its aims and scope, whether the question and aim are clear, timely, relevant, and interesting, and then for the selective journals, whether the work is completely new and very important, whether the references are accurate and suitable, and there's enough theory in the introduction, and whether the methods are appropriate and reproducible. Are the findings and illustrations presented well and discussed in the context of the past literature, and you've included things like limitations as well as future implications and other conclusions supported. Now, bear in mind that reviewers will be looking for more evidence if you're trying to convince them of something completely new, a completely new theory, or if you're disagreeing with something that's actually quite well established or accepted in the field. So if you're disagreeing with the consensus or you're trying to prove something completely new, you'll need more evidence or more types of evidence. So think like a reviewer. Reviewers have to list strengths and weaknesses and to recommend improvements in your paper. So remember the cartoon at the beginning, it might feel like the reviewers are trying to attack your paper, but they are trying to help you improve your paper before it gets accepted. If they find some problems or mistakes, then the readers will find problems and mistakes, and later on, your paper could get corrected or retracted. So they're trying to help you find the problems early on. So this means that you have to admit if there are some weaknesses with your paper and try to address that within your paper. Otherwise, the reviewers will think of something you haven't thought of, and it looks like you're trying to hide a weakness. It's difficult to check for fraud, but reviewers do sometimes detect plagiarism and legal or ethical problems, but also flaws with the methods or the language. So there might be contradictions or bias or confounding factors, sampling error, not enough data, or problems with validity and reliability. Now, the reviewers aren't meant to look at the language, but if it's poorly presented, the language does get in the way. So it would be a shame if you had a good message and good data, but it got obscured and hidden by poor language. So sometimes the reviewers may comment on the language, or they might reject a paper because they couldn't understand it. So do bear in mind the different rules in English, that you have to have perfect English for the syntax and grammar, for the different words to combine into sentences. You have to have good semantics, so the words together in sentences have to make sense. And then another level, which people don't often think about, is pragmatics. What is the author actually trying to say with those sentences in a specific context? And finally, the journal style, or what we know as academic style, or register or genre, will be the way that the audience will expect the authors to behave and write their paper and communicate with their community. So all these things depend on the bottom up, the syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So if there's a problem with any of the language, it might cloud the final message, and also it might be the wrong style for the journal. So that's another reason for rejection. So there will be some formal words and phrases. There will be some abstract concepts as nouns and technical terms. There will be some long, complex sentences, but make sure your paragraphs are clear. The journal will prefer impersonal or objective language that's not too generalized or certain or promotional or speculative or emotional. And there should be logical flow in your messages with no gaps, no digressions, no repetitions, and good argumentation with valid arguments, so all the claims are supported. Then, of course, for journals, they have specific article types and structures that they'll tell you about in the author guidelines. But commonly, there's going to be things like the title, abstract, different subheadings, illustrations, footnotes, declarations, but also citing and referencing in a certain style to give context for your paper. And finally, to be professional and to be ethical and legal in your field, you have to quote or paraphrase other people's work. Don't just copy it. And you might need to have copyright permission to use it if you're quoting a large section of text or reusing a figure. Set your work well and show that you're critically thinking about your work. So a research article isn't just pouring out your data and hoping that the reader understands. You have to help the reader understand, and at the same time, don't be biased, and you have to be polite. So polite both to the reader and in the peer review process, in all your correspondence with the journal and editors and reviewers. So in your correspondence, as well as your main paper, you have to be credible and competent to show that you're a professional researcher. So another tip is to check through your work many times, but each time look for something very specific. So here, there are lots of C words to help you. So make sure your work is clear and concise and correct. It's complete, it's current, it's consistent. You've been very careful, especially presenting your data. It's courteous to your reader and the journal. It's considerate, so you make your work easy to read, not difficult and too technical. It's coherent and logical in its messaging, and it's convincing, so you've provided enough data and evidence to convince your reader. Now, after peer review, there are a few outcomes. If you're lucky, you might get accepted straight away, which is quite rare, or accepted after a few revisions. Most likely, you'd be asked to revise and resubmit after minor or major revision. Or if you're unlucky, your paper gets rejected. There might be an invitation to resubmit your paper. That's a soft rejection. Or you might not get that chance. That's a hard rejection. So the wording, sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not clear. So if you do get a rejection letter, stay calm and ask a colleague to check the wording. If it's a soft rejection, they haven't completely outright rejected your paper, there's still a chance to resubmit it. They might give you a future date deadline, or they might not mention it, but they haven't said it's completely rejected. So if you do have a chance, see whether it's possible to improve the paper and resubmit it. But if it's a hard rejection, then they say, actually, it doesn't fit the aims and scope of the paper, of the journal, then you can't really argue that. You can't make it fit the aims and scope. But there might be a chance for cascading or transferable review. So either they'll mention it, or you can ask for your paper to be transferred to a related journal from the same family or same publisher. Or you might have a desk rejection letter where, again, you might have the chance to resubmit. So see if your paper is fixable. So if you do get a rejection, decide if you want to appeal, whether it's a desk rejection or a hard rejection, and consult the journal guidelines for how you appeal. Otherwise, revise or edit or redo some of the study as advised by the peer reviewers to try to fix some of the problems and find a better matched journal. Fine-tune the paper to the new journal style, update any data, but also check the references. So read the literature and update any references that have been published since you submitted last. And then in your new cover letter, don't get the name of the journal or editor wrong. The new journal might ask you about past rejections, so be transparent, get permission to share the old peer review reports and try to address most of those peer reviewers' comments and say how the paper was actually improved since the last submission, but you can explain, oh, it didn't fit the aims and scope of that journal. And if your paper has a limitation and makes it not publishable, but it's still ethical, then an idea is to put it online as a preprint or upload it to an open access repository like Figshare, Dryad, and Zenodo so other people can find your work and still cite it. But if your work was unethical, then unfortunately it can't be published or used. So here are some tips to avoid peer review rejection. So similar to the desk rejection tips, match the journal and criteria and adhere to all the requirements. So be honest with whether the study is a big one and is going to make the worldwide news and is a global advancement. So really check the size and scope of your study and the advancement. There's nothing wrong with an incremental small advancement. Just find the right match for the right aims and scope of a journal. Be honest if the study is just a pilot study or it's a replication or confirmatory study, or if you have negative or inconclusive results. Otherwise, you're biasing the literature. Now, something that's easier to do is to use referencing software like Zotero or EndNote or RefWorks or Papers or Mendeley, because that will make sure your reference list is accurate and in the right style, because that's something that some picky journals will look at right at the beginning. And also check the new literature, even in the week that you submit or resubmit, because there might be something published that's relevant to your work that you could include in the introduction or discussion, and that might change the meaning of your work. So another tip is to find the reviewer guidelines that the journal uses, because they will want the reviewers to use those guidelines. So you can do a pre-review stage or ask your colleagues to do a kind of mock peer review so that you can fix any flaws, because the reviewers will definitely be looking for these things, such as the strength of the arguments, whether you've included weaknesses or likely objections, you've discussed negative results or alternative interpretations and explanations, the reporting quality and completeness, and the quality of your statistics, illustrations, and data, and be very clear to distinguish between fact and opinion. And then the language quality. So get your work edited, make sure it's consistent. You haven't set 24% somewhere and then it changes to 25% somewhere else. Make sure the discussion matches the introduction. So you've used similar terms and variables and you really have answered the question that you asked in the introduction. Make sure there's enough context and past literature that you've mentioned. Make sure your work's logical, readable, and in the right academic style. And highlight whenever you can the value of your work to the reader and to the journal. Make sure it's legal and ethical. Say you've used the best method, that your work is useful and is practical and has a use for the real world. How you've answered limitations, addressed limitations in the literature, and how you've suggested how future research can handle some of the limitations that you've identified. So show that you're professional and contributing to your field in as many ways as possible. Even in the peer review process itself, At the revision stage, do use as many of the comments from the reviewers as possible and explain point by point in the point by point letter how and where you address the comments. And if you didn't address the comments, justify politely with evidence. Prepare track changes and clean copies of the file to help the editor and reviewers, and then upload your revision in the correct way on the submission platform. Do ask the journal office if you have any questions, or if one of the reviewers contradicts another reviewer, so you don't know how to revise your paper. So the journal office will help you. Also, if you need time and you might miss the deadline, whether it's a revision deadline or you're trying to redo some of the experiments, then ask in good time that you do need more time. Otherwise, if you miss the deadline, again, that's an automatic rejection because the journal thinks you're not interested in revising your paper. So we've looked at the peer review process, and we've looked at some tips for surviving desk review and avoiding desk rejection. And we looked at avoiding peer review rejection. And I hope you found this webinar useful. And now we come to the questions and answers. So please type your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll have a look at them now. So someone's asked if you'll be able to watch this webinar again. Yes, it's being recorded, so it should be available, and you'll get an email about that data. Another comment, there's still debate as to the worth of open access journals. Can you comment? So open access journal is just the business model. Instead of the reader paying, the author pays sometimes. So sometimes, actually, in many cases, gold open access, where the work is completely free for the reader, you don't pay. The author doesn't have to pay. It's supported by a charity or by the university. So it doesn't mean that you always have to pay. And also the business side should be completely separated from the work, or it has to go through desk review, then peer review. They'll ask you to revise, resubmit your paper. So the quality is going to depend on each journal. And again, do your homework, see what the journal's guidelines say on its peer review process, its acceptance rates, its submission process, things like that. And again, read the journal. Do you trust it? Have you cited from it? Do you find it useful? Do other people cite from the journal? Another comment for, can you receive the presentation? You can watch it again. It will be uploaded somewhere, and you'll be kept in the loop by email. The slides themselves, probably not. They're not shareable because it's AsiaEdit copyrighted, but you can share the recording with your friends. So please continue typing your questions. I did mention something before called pre-registration, so some of you might be wondering about that. So that's to do with protocols, not just clinical human studies, so other disciplines are using them too. So some journals are encouraging authors to submit their methods first, and then the journal will peer review the methods. This is to discourage them from cheating and changing the data later on to try to make it sound like it's very good data, whereas it shouldn't matter what the data are, whether it's positive or negative, as long as it's trustworthy and you stuck to the methods. So some journals invite authors to submit the protocol first for peer review before the results are known. That's called pre-registration, or the protocol is called registered report, and then they'll remember that you passed the peer review process with your protocol, and then when you actually do the study and you stuck to the protocol, it doesn't matter what the results are, they'll still publish the full paper later on. So there's a website called osf.io/rr, and that will tell you more about registered reports. So we have a comment here. If in the revision and resubmission process, the editors give good advice, if you follow that advice, do you have a higher chance of acceptance? So of course, if the reviewers give good advice and it makes sense and you agree with it, so they're trying to help you improve your paper so that it's better either for that journal, or if it gets rejected still, it would still be better and in better shape for another journal. So don't blindly follow all their advice. Some reviewers might be a bit sneaky and force you to cite all their work so that they get better citation scores. So if there's something you don't agree with, then you don't have to do it. And then you can talk to the editorial office if you're suspicious that they're trying to make you cite all their work. But if the advice makes sense, then of course follow the advice and revise the work as they advised you to, whether it's the language or illustrations or even the analysis. And then explain in your point-by-point letter exactly how you followed their advice. So you can thank them for advice, and if you honestly think it improved the paper, you can say that, thank you for helping us improve that analysis, it really does help. So it will help. They're trying to help you improve the paper. They can't guarantee it will be accepted because there's other reviewers and the editor makes the final decision. But if the peer review comments make sense, then do use it. Some open access publishers publish within 4 weeks. Please comment on this. Actually, yes, I didn't give the expected timings. So when I did desk rejection, it should only take 1 or 2 weeks, because it's not fair to make authors wait when there's no chance for peer review. So put them out of their misery quickly. So if you haven't heard from a journal from even the first, not decision, but the first action item, then definitely by a month ask, will it actually be peer reviewed or not? Because you want to take the paper somewhere else. So within a month, you should know whether it's been desk reviewed and desk rejected. And then peer review itself takes anything from 1 month to 3 months. If it's something like COVID pandemic, then it's an emergency, and editors and reviewers will act more quickly. And if there's any danger that they were too quick and missed something, then there's always the correction and retraction process later on. So we do want to make sure the scholarly record is credible and trustworthy. So the timing, of course, it depends on how fast the organization is. Something definitely to be aware of is if a journal guarantees acceptance or says 1-day acceptance, or just pay the fee and it will be accepted, then you know that it's a predatory journal trying to steal your money. Where can you find reference software? You can just Google any reference, with academic referencing, but the famous ones are EndNote and Papers, RefWorks, Mendeley, Zotero. Libraries normally will subscribe to EndNote, so some you do have to pay for, but some are free, or you use the online platform. Or someone says, how can you present this? Or they want more of this type of seminar. Yes, we will. AsiaEdit will be doing more of these webinars in the future. And someone else says, please share what are the common sites to check the impact factor of a journal. So that will be the Clarivate company that owns the impact factor, and they publish JCR, journal citation reports, once a year. So that will be the Clarivate website, but it's a paid service. But some journals put their impact factor on their website. Okay, maybe there's time for 1 or 2 more questions, so please type in the Q&A box. A question people often ask me is, can you publish something that you've presented at a conference? So normally the global answer is yes, if it's just an abstract or poster or slide presentation. But it's more of a gray area if you actually published a short or full-length paper in a conference supplement or conference proceedings, because then the full paper has been published, especially if there's an ISBN or ISSN. So journals will say, please let us know if you have published similar work. So be transparent, and if it's anything more than just the abstract, then tell the journal at the submission stage where the work has been published before, even if it's a short paper. Sometimes they allow it, sometimes they don't, but at least you'll know. And sometimes they say, oh, you can add to the shorter paper as long as you cite it and have copyright permission, and you add 40% or 50% new data or new intellectual content. So it is possible if you've presented your work before, but check the journal policy. Okay, a final question. What's the big difference between US journals and UK European journals? There's probably no difference apart from the spelling they use. So the publisher country shouldn't matter. It's a international journal is an international journal. And the things to look for are things like policy, peer review process, journal guidelines, aims and scope. So once you know what to look for, then you'll know for all journals what to look for. And then read the journal, see if it's useful, ask your research group, ask your supervisor, have they submitted to the journal before? Do they find the journal useful? Do they cite the journal? Okay, so we're coming up to the hour. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time and attention and for joining this webinar. And you can find other webinars and free educational resources on the AsiaEdit.com website. And we hope to also be producing more of this type of webinar in the future, so stay tuned. And I hope you found this webinar useful. Until next time, I wish you success and goodbye and stay safe.